flow over the sugar fields of St. Landry Parish. The river gave one back. The workers found at first a burlap sack, bloated and half sunk where the water bent around a cypress root. It took 4 men to pull it ashore. They thought it might be another drowned hog, or a bale gone adrift from the last shipment down to Baton Rouge. But when the fabric tore beneath a boot heel, a pale hand fell out slender, severed, with a gold ring still clinging to bone. Within an hour, Sheriff Jean Lagrange was on site. He ordered the men to fetch a priest, not because he believed in sin more than evidence, but because the air around that sack already stank of something unholy. When they slit the rest of it open, chunks spilled out flesh, slick and white, like butchered pork. Some wrapped in cloth, others bound with ribbon. One piece bore the unmistakable curve of a jawline, another the lobe of an ear with the pearl earring still attached. By sundown, more pieces had surfaced downstream, a total of 71 fragments, according to the coroner's ledger later filed in Opelousas. The body, once reassembled in rough order, was that of Colonel Lucien Delaroche, a sugar baron whose name commanded fear along every road from New Orleans to Lake Charles. But what made the discovery unbearable wasn't simply the mutilation, it was the precision. Each cut was deliberate, surgical, almost reverent. Pinned to his chest cavity, what remained of it was a scrap of calico fabric embroidered in black thread. "I am no one's property." The newspapers at first refused to print the detail, but rumor spreads faster than ink in a small parish. By week's end, whispers of the Delaroche butcher carried through every tavern and church pew. And in the center of those whispers, one name, spoken low, almost with awe. Clara. Clara, they said, had once been Delaroche's house girl. Others said concubine, others prisoner. She was gone now, vanished into the marshes, leaving only blood and legend behind. The Delaroche family buried what was left of the colonel in an iron coffin beneath the family chapel, guarded night and day. But even then, dogs howled through the night, and no one could stand the smell that hung over that land for weeks, a sour, sweet rot, like molasses poured over death. This is not a story about revenge. It is a story about power and what happens when it festers too long inside the walls of privilege. It's about Louisiana's golden sugar age, when fortunes were built on broken backs and screams were swallowed by the bayou. And it's about one woman who decided one night that she would rather haunt her oppressor than serve him another dawn. Before we continue with the story of Clara, the runaway who carved her master into 71 pieces, join our community of mystery lovers. Hit subscribe and tell us in the comments which state you're listening from. Your support helps us uncover more forgotten stories like this one. The Louisiana of 1847 was a land of contradictions. On one hand, wealth glimmered everywhere, white-columned mansions rising above sugar fields. The scent of honeysuckle and rum drifting from verandas where ladies fanned themselves beneath painted parasols. On the other, misery rotted just beneath that perfume in the quarters behind every grand house, where enslaved men and women labored 16 hours a day, their sweat feeding an empire. Sugar was called white gold. It built dynasties, but it also killed faster than any war. In the sweltering heat of parishes like St. Landry, St. Mary, and Terrebonne, enslaved laborers worked the boiling houses' rooms hotter than hell itself, stirring copper kettles of juice that hissed and spat like molten glass. Many never survived past 30. They slept in sheds of cypress plank, 10 or 12 to a room, the air thick with insects, the floors slick with spilled syrup. Colonel Lucien Delaroche's plantation, Bel Hombre, was among the largest, over 1,000 acres of cane fields sloping toward the Atchafalaya River. Delaroche himself was a man molded by the old Creole aristocracy. His family traced their lineage to French officers who had crossed the Atlantic in the 1700s, bringing with them the manners of Versailles and the cruelty of empire. He wore his hair slicked with bear grease, his waistcoat always buttoned too tight for comfort. He spoke softly, with the kind of voice that made people listen. Locals described him as civilized. But the enslaved whispered another word: diable, the devil. They said the colonel had a taste for discipline that went beyond the lash. He owned an imported iron restraint called the Virgin's Embrace, a grotesque contraption shaped like a corseted woman. Once locked inside, a person could neither kneel nor stand fully upright, forced to remain in agony until they collapsed. It was rumored that the colonel's overseer, a man named Silas Mott, buried 3 men alive for trying to escape Bel Ombre. The colonel called it an example. New Orleans, just 2 days' ride south, was the beating heart of this empire. In the French Quarter, coffeehouses buzzed with gossip about sugar prices, Caribbean revolts, and the latest shipments from Havana. The city reeked of spice and decay, the smell of rum, rotting fruit, and river mud mingling in the November heat. The Creole elite threw masquerade balls at the St. Louis Hotel, while, in the slave pens along Chartres Street, human beings were auctioned beneath the same chandeliers that glittered above their masters' dances. Clara's name first appeared in a ledger of Bel Ombre in 1838. Age 13. Origin: Louisiana-born mulatto. Value: $500. The record notes she was quick-handed in domestic tasks, assigned to the main house as a chambermaid. That was the language of the time code, transactional, but what it meant in truth was that Clara lived within reach of Delaroche himself. The enslaved quarters called the Big House, the mouth of the snake, beautiful from the outside, but filled with things that swallowed you whole. The parish church bells rang every Sunday, but they could not drown the sound of the cane mills grinding all week long, a steady moan of gears and chains, echoing through cypress swamp and field. The enslaved population of Louisiana by the 1840s had swelled to nearly 170,000. French planters prided themselves on refinement, yet their plantations were built upon a system more brutal than anything seen in the Upper South. Mortality rates were higher here, labor harsher, punishment constant. To the outside world, this was a place of grace and civility, music from parlor pianos, the murmur of French spoken over dinner. But beneath it, superstition thrived. Voodoo and Catholicism intertwined like vines. People whispered prayers to both the Virgin Mary and to spirits of the river, asking them to keep away sickness or to curse a cruel master. In every bayou hamlet there were stories of restless souls that walked the levees, of blood that refused to wash from the earth. And Bel Ombre had more stories than most. A traveler from Lafayette once wrote in his diary that, when he passed the plantation at dusk, he saw a figure standing among the canes, a woman in a white shift, her face turned toward the horizon, still as a statue. When he blinked, she was gone. The entry was dated 3 years before the colonel's death. What made Louisiana unique wasn't just its violence, but its silence. The power of the planters was absolute. Sheriffs, priests, judges, all dined at the same tables. The Delaroche donated the bell tower to the parish church, built a school for white children, and hosted political gatherings. No one dared question how many coffins their sugar wealth required. Yet, even among the rich, the winds were changing. By the mid-1840s, abolitionist pamphlets from the North had begun to circulate secretly along the river routes. The fear of insurrection, still fresh from the Haitian Revolution half a century earlier, haunted every plantation owner. Rumors of runaways forming maroon camps in the swamps made even hardened overseers keep pistols beneath their pillows. And somewhere in that tension, in that stew of fear, superstition, and blood, a girl named Clara decided she would no longer be afraid. But to understand her, We must return to the house itself, Bel Hombre, where every board and mirror seem to hold a secret. Its walls still stand today, though the cane has long since withered. Visitors say that on humid nights, you can smell molasses and iron. The local children won't go near the cellar. They say that's where the colonel kept the embrace, rusted now but still humming when the moon is full. And if you look closely at the old portrait hanging in the parlor, the one of Lucien Delaroche and his wife in their Sunday finery, you'll notice a shadow in the background, half hidden behind the curtain. A young girl, her eyes fixed on something just beyond the frame. They say that's Clara, the last time anyone saw her before the blood began to flow. They said she was born beneath a thunderstorm. The plantation midwife, an elderly woman everyone called Tante Zélie, told it often, how the sky had split open the night Clara came screaming into the world, lightning flickering through the cracks in the cabin walls. Her mother, Ruth, had been one of Delaroche's field women, a strong-backed worker with hands calloused from cutting cane. She died of fever before Clara turned 7, leaving the girl to the mercy of the house servants. She never cried long, Tante Zélie said once. Even as a baby, her tears would stop too soon, like she learned fast the world wouldn't listen. By 13, Clara had grown into a slim, sharp-featured girl with amber eyes that seemed to reflect more than they revealed. Her skin was a soft bronze, her hair dark and heavy, often tied back with a faded ribbon she'd scavenged from the mistress's sewing chest. She moved silently through the great house, lighting lamps, washing linens, tending the fire as if the air itself bent around her to avoid making a sound. But when she sang, the sound could stop conversation in the dining room. Her voice carried a sadness so pure that even the colonel's guests would pause mid-toast. "Where did you learn that song?" one visiting merchant once asked. Clara kept her gaze low. "My mama hummed it when the thunder came," she said. Lucien Delaroche, watching from the head of the table, smiled faintly. "Then the girl's voice was forged by God himself," he remarked, "and given to me by Providence." That was how he spoke with the conviction of a man who believed even beauty was property. Colonel Lucien Delaroche was 53 that year, a man of contradictions, polished and monstrous in equal measure. He spoke 4 languages, quoted Voltaire, and carried a small Bible bound in red leather that he read every morning before breakfast. But the same hand that turned those pages had once broken a man's jaw with a riding crop. He claimed to believe in order, divine, natural, and social. The Delaroche family motto, carved into the marble lintel above the front door, read, "Tout est dû à la force." All things are owed to strength. He loved to show visitors his library, with its French volumes on agriculture and philosophy. Yet his true fascination was control the bending of will. He wrote notes about it in his private journal, found decades later during the reconstruction of the house. The Negro's spirit must be subdued not merely by punishment, but by confusion. They must never know where mercy begins or ends. That uncertainty is the true bridle. He saw himself not as a tyrant, but as a custodian of civilization in a savage land. He often told the priest that his methods were necessary to maintain divine order. Discipline, he'd say, is an act of love in a corrupt world. Yet every servant at Bel Hombre knew what discipline meant after nightfall. Sometimes it began with footsteps in the corridor, deliberate and slow. Then the soft click of a door latch. Clara's door. Mistress Geneviève Delaroche rarely left her chambers by then. She had once been a radiant woman, born to French nobility in Pointe-Coupée, her youth filled with soirees and imported perfume. But years of fever and childbirth had left her frail, her body heavy with laudanum. Her hair had thinned. Her eyes, though once bright blue, were dulled by the tinctures she drank each night to sleep. Yet she noticed more than she pretended. She noticed when her husband's boots stopped outside Clara's room, She noticed when the girl flinched at his voice. "She's growing too pretty," Genevieve murmured once to her maid, a timid woman named Odette. Odette kept her eyes down. "Yes, madame. You think I don't see it?" He looks at her the way men look at mirrors, not at what's there, but what they want to see. Maybe she's afraid of him, madame." Genevieve's lips twitched. Then she's wiser than most. The mistress could have intervened, but she didn't. Perhaps she feared her husband more than she pitied the girl. Perhaps her morphine-drenched nights numbed whatever pity remained. In that house, guilt was just another form of silence. The overseer, Silas Mott, was another matter entirely. He was a wiry man from Tennessee with a face like weathered bark, his left eye clouded by a scar from an old knife fight. He spoke with the flat tone of someone who'd buried empathy long ago. The enslaved feared him more than the whip itself. Mott had arrived at Bel Hombre after serving as overseer on 2 other plantations, both notorious for their high death tolls. Efficient, Lucien called him. A man of resolve. The quarters said he carried a small pouch of salt and ashes tied around his neck, a charm from some swamp witch he'd once known. "Keeps the black spirits off me," he'd joke, but everyone knew he had his own ghosts. Mott was the one who taught the younger boys how to use the cane knives properly. "Keep it low and mean," he'd say, slicing through a stalk with a single swing. "And if you ever raise it at me, you better not miss." He was also the one who dragged Clara back from the woods the first time she tried to run. She couldn't have been more than 16. They found her barefoot, covered in mud and mosquito bites, halfway to the bayou road. Mott hauled her by the arm back to the house like a sack of grain. When the colonel saw her, wild-eyed, shivering, defiant, he didn't shout. He just looked at her quietly for a long moment. Then he told Mott, "Fetch the embrace." That night thunder cracked above Bel Hombre again, the same kind Tante Zélie swore had heralded Clara's birth. The embrace was kept in the cellar, a human-shaped cage of iron bars, its inside lined with dull spikes meant to press, but not pierce. Mott and another man forced Clara into it, locking the door until her breath came in short, choked gasps. Delaroche watched, his expression calm, almost curious.
"Somewhere."
"Let her pray," he said. "Prayer purifies." They left her there for hours, maybe days, no record says exactly how long. When Odette brought her water, Clara whispered something through the bars. "What was it?" Odette would later tell the priest, trembling. She said, "He can't own what God already cursed." After that, something in Clara changed.
Along the banks of Louisiana,
She did her work as before, quiet, obedient, but her eyes no longer looked down.
Deliberately destroyed
They looked
in
through.
1859.
Visitors began to sense it too.
New Orleans
A
reference
northern
murder
businessman
trial that
once
ended
commented
abruptly,
after dinner,
with all
"There's a
transcripts
chill
sealed
about
by
that girl,
judicial order.
like she's walking with a
Local
shadow
parish
beside
registries show 71
her."
separate
Delaroche
burial.
laughed. "Every slave walks with a shadow. Mine just happened to know who owns it." But not long after, strange things began to happen around Bel Hombre. Small things, at first too easy to dismiss. The horses startled for no reason at night. The sugar kettles boiled over when no one was near. The portrait of the colonel's father fell from the wall, its glass shattered clean in 2. Genevieve's maid claimed to hear humming from the cellar when it was empty. Clara's song, low and mournful, echoing through stone. When asked, Clara denied it. "I don't sing no more," she said simply. But her voice carried a tone that made Odette cross herself. In those days, punishment left scars, but silence left ghosts, and the house of Delaroche began to collect both. Mott grew uneasy. Once, he caught Clara standing by the edge of the cane field at dawn, staring into the fog. "You planning another run, girl?" he barked. She didn't move. He grabbed her shoulder roughly, spinning her around. "Answer when I—" He froze. Her eyes met his steady, unblinking. There was no fear there, only a kind of weary pity. You best be careful, she said softly. Blood remembers. That night, Mott dreamt of the fields burning. He told no one, but he started wearing 2 charms instead of 1. The colonel's power in the parish remained unchallenged, but the land itself seemed to turn against him. Crops spoiled without reason. Tools rusted overnight. And when a fever swept through the quarters, killing 7 workers in a week, even the priest hesitated to bless the house. Sin draws sickness, he told Genevieve quietly one evening. Perhaps it's time your husband shows mercy. She stared at him through a haze of opium. Mercy left this house a long time ago, Father. Delaroche dismissed such talk as superstition. The weak always look for omens when they lack will, he said. But I am my own providence. Yet late at night, alone in his study, he began hearing things the creak of floorboards, a soft humming behind the walls. Once, while reading his ledger, he found a single sugar crystal lying atop the page. He brushed it aside, but when he looked again, there were 3. He told himself it was exhaustion, the mind playing tricks. But something deep within him, something old and Catholic, began to tremble. And through it all, Clara moved like a shadow in daylight, silent, efficient, untouchable. She tended Genevieve, brought food to the sick, soothed children with songs the way her mother once had. To the other enslaved, she became a figure of quiet strength. They whispered that she had seen the devil and refused to bow. She's marked, Tante Zélie said one night, stirring herbs over the fire. But not by evil, by justice. Justice? One of the men scoffed. Ain't no justice here. Zélie's eyes gleamed in the firelight. Then maybe she'll make one. Mott was already afraid of her. In late September, a priest arrived from Baton Rouge, Father Mathieu, a thin man with tired eyes. He'd been called by Genevieve herself, who sent Odette to deliver a letter begging for confession and blessing. When he arrived, the house felt wrong from the moment he crossed the threshold. I remember, he later told the sheriff. The air smelled of sugar and rot, like the sweetness had gone bad. Genevieve refused to leave her bed. She clutched her rosary, fingers trembling, and whispered, Father, there's something here. It moves when he sleeps. It watches when I pray. He assumed she meant guilt, the fever of a woman trapped too long under her husband's cruelty. But then she said, It wears her face. The priest frowned. Whose face? Clara's. When he asked to see the girl, Clara appeared in the doorway, silent, calm. Do you believe in evil, Father? She asked softly. He nodded. Then you should know some of us are born in it, and some of us are made. Father Mathieu tried to bless her. She didn't flinch, but the candle beside her guttered out in the draught, though no window was open. That night, the priest refused to sleep inside the house. He stayed in the carriage, rosary clutched tight, muttering prayers until dawn. By morning, he was gone, left without a word, his driver whipping the horses hard down the bayou road. Genevieve died 3 days later. They buried her under the live oak behind the chapel, her coffin small and pale, her face powdered until she looked almost peaceful. The parish came to pay their respects, though most only came to gossip. Clara stood at the edge of the crowd, head bowed. The colonel didn't look at her once. But later that night, the servants swore they saw him standing alone by the grave, his lantern flickering, his voice low and slurred with brandy. He spoke to the dirt as though it could answer. You cursed me, he muttered. You left your madness in this house. When he stumbled back to his study, he found a single lily lying on his desk, the same kind his wife loved. Its stem was wet, as though freshly plucked. but the grave had been sealed hours before. He threw it into the fire. The next morning, Clara was gone from her quarters. For 2 days, Mott and a group of men scoured the swamps. They found nothing but tracks leading into the cypress thickets, and then vanishing as if the ground had swallowed her whole. Delaroche grew wild with rage. "She cannot survive out there," he shouted. "No one does." But deep inside, he knew it wasn't true. He knew the girl had something that belonged to both the living and the dead, a kind of inheritance no whip could break. By the 4th night, the house fell silent. The servants spoke in whispers, afraid to even look toward the fields. The colonel drank himself into a stupor. Mott locked the doors and kept his pistol close. That's when the dogs began to howl. It started low, then built into a chorus that made the hair rise on every neck. When Mott stepped outside to quiet them, he froze. The moon hung red, swollen, and across the yard something glimmered small, metallic. He approached slowly. It was a mirror shard, half buried in mud. When he lifted it, his own reflection stared back, except the eyes were not his. He dropped it and ran. Inside the house, the colonel woke to the sound of humming. At first he thought it was the wind through the shutters, but then he recognized the tune, Clara's song. He followed it down the hallway, barefoot, a candle trembling in his hand. The music led him toward the parlor, where moonlight pooled across the floorboards like spilled milk. The piano stood open. Its keys moved, one by one, though no hands touched them. He stumbled backward, the candle falling from his grip, and in the brief flare of flame before it died, he saw her standing at the far end of the room. "Clara," he breathed. But the figure didn't answer. It only smiled, a thin, sorrowful smile, and then was gone when the light blinked out. By morning, the colonel's hair had turned almost white at the temples. He refused to speak of it, but the servants noticed he started locking his door at night. The weeks that followed blurred into a delirium of fear. Mott claimed to see shadows moving across the fields. The workers heard whispers under the mill's turning wheel. Even the riverboats passing by reported strange lights flickering in the cane at midnight. Some said it was witchcraft. Others said vengeance. But one thing was certain, something had changed in the air around Bel Ombre. Odette, too, began seeing things. One evening she went to fetch water from the well and found a string of small objects hanging from the handle bones, tied with red thread. She screamed and dropped the bucket. When Mott came running, she pointed with shaking hands. "It's her," she cried. "She's come back." Mott spat. "She's dead or gone. Ain't no ghost here but the ones you bring." But later, when he tried to untie the charms, he found they wouldn't come loose. The knots seemed fused as though sealed with blood. Then came the final warning. On the night of October 17th, the colonel woke to find his window open. The curtains billowing through the air was still. On his bedside table lay a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was a lock of his own hair, tied with that same red ribbon Clara once wore. He burned it immediately, but the next morning he found another on the desk in his study. That evening, he called Mott into the room. "She's toying with me," Delaroche hissed. "If she's alive, I'll see her dragged back and flayed. If she's dead, I'll see her bones burned to ash." Mott nodded. "We'll find her, sir." "You'd better," Delaroche growled. "Because if I see her first, I'll—" He stopped. The mirror behind him trembled, just a quiver, like a ripple on water. They both turned, and in the glass, faint but clear, was the reflection of a woman standing between them, though the room itself was empty. "Christ Almighty," Mott whispered. The colonel didn't sleep again for the next 3 nights. By the end of the month, Bel Ombre was barely functioning. The cane rotted in the fields. The workers murmured prayers instead of songs. And the once proud Colonel Delaroche sat in his study, curtains drawn, pistol in hand, a man haunted not by ghosts, but by consequence. He wrote in his journal one final entry before the blood began to flow. Something walks in this house that wears her face, but it is not her. It is my judgment made flesh. And 2 days later, the river gave its first piece back. The news arrived like a fever. What had been whispers in taverns and the low murmur of women at wash troughs hardened into something louder, a parade of accusations, prayers, and wagers on what would come next. Men in braided coats walked the dirt roads with their hats low, and in the markets the talk was not of sugar or shipping, but of the butchered body they had heard about. The river boats carried the tale upriver and down. By the time the first journalist from New Orleans rolled into Opelousas with his boots caked in mud, the parish had already given itself over to a kind of collective tremor. Sheriff Jean Lagrange stood on the steps of his modest office the morning the reporter arrived, watching the town like a man who suspected every shadow concealed a blade. He was a broad-shouldered man with close-cropped hair and a face the sun had baked flat. He had known Delaroche for years, had signed the colonel's petitions, and collected his donations for the parish school. He had also taken a corporal's share of those donations one night when the courthouse roof needed patching. The conflict of loyalties sat in his chest like a stone. "Sheriff," said the reporter Elias Marceau, who wrote for a paper with ink that loved scandal, "your parish has a story the city will read. Tell me exactly what happened." Lagrange thought for a long beat, watching a horse clip past with a rider who glanced furtively toward Bel Ombre. "A man was killed," he said finally. "Mutilated." He felt the syllables sour to his tongue as if he'd tasted something forbidden. "We found pieces of him in the river, 71 in all. Whoever did this worked with intent." Marceau's eyes flashed. "And the name?" Lagrange hesitated. "Colonel Lucien Delaroche." At the mention, the reporter's face went from professional detachment to outright hunger. "And the motive? The murderer?" "That's what we're trying to discover." Lagrange looked at him, the sheriff's voice low. "Many in this parish want answers, but answers like horses can spit and bolt if you don't hold them right." The coroner, Dr. Henri Moreau, arrived the next morning with his leather case and an expression seasoned by too many infections and too few certainties. He had studied in Philadelphia and fancied himself a man of rational instruments, scalpels, scales, inked papers. When he first unwrapped the linen from the colonel's remains, he worked with an appraising silence. The cuts were clean, the bone work precise. He called to mind surgical manuals he had read beneath oil lamp and imagined hands that knew anatomy. He wrote in his ledger with a trembling hand. "This is not the work of a panicked mob," he said to Lagrange and to Father Mathieu, who had returned reluctantly to the parish at the sheriff's insistence. "This is precise, deliberate. Whoever did this knew where to cut to prevent immediate death. It could be a knowledge of anatomy, or a thorough hatred." Father Mathieu, who still smelled faintly of travel, closed his eyes. The priest had known Delaroche in the sacristy and had drunk with him at church fundraisers. He had heard the colonel's confessions of civic concern and pious intentions. To see his name on a slab of butchered flesh was an affront to the cosseted order he'd been raised to protect. "If it is hatred," the priest said, "it is a hatred that will require confession and penance. But we must not rush to accuse the living without the light of evidence." Evidence, the sheriff thought, was something that slid like a fish from your hands if you weren't careful. The parish was a closed system. Planters, priests, judges, and merchants moved in the same circles. Delaroche's donated pews bore the same varnish as the city council's table. The question of whether anyone in that circle could be implicated would be poisonous to ask aloud. Word of Clara fluttered through the town like a moth at a candle. Some swore she had cut him. Others said she had not, that no woman, no enslaved woman could have done such surgical work. Yet the rumor persisted. The mulatto chambermaid who had run off after the mistress's funeral, who had once been locked in the iron contraption in the cellar and who had whispered, some said, of blood remembering. People imagined her at the edge of the cane, singing to herself, chipping away at a blade with the patience of a saint bent on vengeance. Lagrange had his work to do. He interviewed every hand who had worked the colonel's house. He sat across from servants and planters, asking the same questions until his lips grew dry. Silas Mott, the overseer, came in one afternoon with his coat dusted in cane pollen. He sat across from the sheriff and sharpened a pocket knife with slow, careful motions as he spoke. She was quiet, like a river under ice, Mott said, eyes fixed on the knife. I caught her trying to slip out after the burial. She must have had accomplices out there, marshmen perhaps, people who can live in the muck and bring him to his knees. Lagrange noted the assumption like a bruise. You say accomplices. Aye. Mott's hand tightened. You have maroons in the swamps sometimes, hidden folk who'll do what must be done for coin or grudge. But more than that, the girl had a look in her eyes, like someone who'd seen 100 things a child shouldn't. I've seen that look before. I asked the men in the quarters, the sheriff answered. They say Clara was missing. They say they saw her go, but nearly everyone says they never saw anyone working alone in the house at night. The colonel kept certain things hidden. If anyone had the skill to do those incisions, where would they have learned it? The coroner's notes suggest a steady hand. Dr. Moreau raised an eyebrow when Lagrange presented him with Silas's theory of maroons. Musk and tar, thieves and marshmen. Few have the surgical patience this work required. A man like Delaroche would have known his enemy. The surgeon's hand betrays training or desperate practice. It is too precise to be random. A seam of conspiracy began to form then. The idea that either Clara had acquired rare skills, perhaps tending the sick in the quarters, watching funerals, learning how to mend bones, or she had helpers with knowledge of anatomy. The parish had a few itinerant doctors, an apothecary who kept a ledger of tinctures and poultices in a corner by the market. Lagrange sent for the apothecary's books. He also subpoenaed the household accounts, purchases of rum, of scalpels, of linen. Meanwhile, Elias Marceau placed his quill like a dagger to paper and wrote in capitals in the city edition about a woman scorned and the barbarity of a region where justice sleeps in the arms of the slaveholder. His columns inflamed both sympathy and outrage. In New Orleans parlors, men read his words like an accusation. In the parish, those same words were bashed down like a hammer on a hot nail. Trials in Louisiana were social theater as much as law. The courts belonged to the respectable. The respectable did not like to speak ill of one another. Lagrange had to walk a narrow line, prosecute a crime with enough gravity to satisfy justice, but not so loudly that it dragged every planter's name through the mud. He began to suspect that the crime's significance extended beyond a single act of brutality. It threatened to illuminate a system of violence that many preferred unaccounted for. Witnesses did not always tell the same story. The housemaid Odette, who had been delicate and fearful since she began serving Genevieve, swore she had seen Clara in the yard the night before the colonel was found. She was singing, Odette told the sheriff, with hands that would not stop trembling. She had something in her hands. It looked like a piece of coat. She looked like she was talking to herself. "You're sure?" Lagrange asked. "She did not speak to me, but her lips moved," Odette said. "She looked like someone who thinks the world owes her nothing." In contrast, a field hand named Baptiste, a blunt man with scars on his knuckles, insisted he had seen nothing. "If I'd seen Clara, I'd say. But I don't leave the fields at night. I sleep when I can." He spat into the dirt. "We don't kill our masters. We run, we hide, we break tools, but we don't pull a man apart like a hog." The defensive character was as chaotic as a summer storm. People projected their fears and their need for order onto these testimonies. Many whispered that the Delaroche children grown and away at school must be implicated somehow. Others pointed at political enemies of the colonel, He had squabbled with a shipping magnate over a mill in New Orleans, and revenge can take the strangest forms. The coroner's ledger became a public obsession. Dr. Moreau invited the sheriff and a small committee from the parish to view the anatomical notes. He explained in clipped words how someone had used a specific sequence of incisions to separate muscle from bone, to preserve organs in a way that suggested intention rather than rage. But each cut prevents hemorrhage until the final removal, he said. This is not cruelty alone. This is a statement. A statement, Father Mathieu echoed, the word bitter on his tongue. What kind of statement justifies butchery? Perhaps the kind that says, I am no one's property, Lagrange said quietly. At once the priest slapped his palm to his forehead. God help us. Then rumors of ritual began. In a world where voodoo and Catholic superstition danced in half-shadow, small men with pale eyes whispered that Clara had not acted alone, but had been guided by spirits or by a certain group of enslaved practitioners who mingled herbs and prayer with the old languages. Others claimed the colonel had been engaged in something darker, that his library contained books, not just on agriculture, but on arcana. That in private, he had experimented with practices he called corrections of the spirit. In this environment, facts were slippery things. One could almost hear them hiss when you tried to press them into a testimony. Then, a letter. Lagrange received a folded page, its edges singed as if someone had tried to remove it from flame. The handwriting was careful, the ink faded. It read simply, You searched the wrong places. Look where the house keeps its shame. No signature. The sheriff felt the message like a hot coal and folded it into his pocket like contraband. And as the inquest approached, men gathered in the courthouse, their faces drawn tight. Dr. Moreau presented the medical findings. Cause of death could not be reduced to a single wound. It was the sum of the wounds, an artful decomposition of a man's life. The jury, all planters and merchants, listened politely, some with their jawlines set as if to grind salt. Outside, congregations of workers watched from the shade of oak trees, their faces unreadable as river stones. Witness after witness stepped forward. Mott recounted the colonel's cruelty with a kind of brutal honesty no one wanted to hear. Delaroche kept to his rules, he said, but some rules are rotten to the core. He spoke of the Virgin's embrace in the cellar like one might speak of a broken machine. The coroner's notes were read aloud, the precision of the cuts, the way the hands had been bound and then freed, the use of a cloth embroidered with a single sentence, I am no one's property. At this, a woman in the crowd, a hired seamstress who had once worked on the Delaroche linens, burst into tears. That fabric, she cried. That is the calico we had in the house. I sew for them. I have seen that pattern. It is the mistress's sewing chest. Gasps went up. The governor's men, when they later read the inquest, would call it circumstantial. But in the parish, such a detail could not be easily dismissed. Whispers began to form into accusations, and then into a slow, terrible logic. The violence had been not only an act of revenge, but a message that tore at the seams of hierarchy. Elias Marceau's dispatches stoked the flames. He wrote of a people who had taken the colonel's life into their own hands, a narrative that suited abolitionists who read the peace in the North as emblematic of the system's rot. In the parish, it read like sedition. What do you think, guilty souls cursed by God or victims of madness? Tell us below. Your theories matter here. The sheriff read that line aloud, a mocking echo from the pages of the city presses, and felt the truth of it bite. The question was part gauntlet, part confession. Everyone had an opinion, and each opinion hardened into a stone that could be thrown. As the inquest wound on, discrepancies widened. Some witnesses embellished, others recanted. A mason testified that he had seen a girl in the lane the week before, but later said his memory had been poor. A neighbor swore he had heard the colonel and Clara arguing in the night. When pressed, he admitted he might have dreamed it. The law required proof. The parish offered only shards. Yet, the political undercurrent could not be ignored. A wealthy planter who had publicly feuded with Delaroche sent gifts to the sheriff, a barrel of French brandy, a set of silver spoons, and suggested that unrest might be quelled with a careful hand. Men in the courthouse drank and laughed and then went to the pews to show contrition, as if penitence could be traded like a ledger entry. Among the workers, fear morphed into resolve. Some suggested running. Others wanted to strike. Old tales of maroon bands forming in the Atchafalaya swamps resurfaced, and with them came panic. The state militia was petitioned by a council of planters. The governor, who had elections to think of and ports to keep calm, advised patience and a firm hand. Lagrange, feeling both the weight of his office and the heat of the planters' eyes upon him, wondered whether justice could survive intact in a parish where the law and the powerful were the same thing. In the weeks before the trial could be convened, Bel Hombre grew quiet in a new, more dreadful way. Men moved in the house without laughter. Dogs stopped barking at night. The river seemed to flatten its waves as though it were trying to hide the things it carried. Some men said it was Clara. Others swore it was more than a woman left fresh lilies on Genevieve's grave. Someone arranged the colonel's portrait so that his painted eyes looked down at the family chapel. Some mornings, the kitchen found rows of knives set out on the table. Each blade pointed inward, as if to remind the household of the thin thread that held order and that could be cut. On the eve of the formal indictment, Sheriff Lagrange sat up late, pen in hand, writing a list of questions he no longer trusted to ask aloud. He played them against the ceiling beams as if they were cards on a table. Who benefits from the colonel's death? Who fears his name more than his policies? Who would have learned to open a man like a book? He folded the paper and pushed it into his pocket. Outside, the river slid by in the dark, keeping its own counsel. Men would say later that the night itself seemed to wait, that the world held its breath as though preparing for a verdict that might not be rendered in any courtroom, but somewhere hotter and stranger still. The day the deputy found the blood on the chapel steps, the parish lost what remained of its composure. It was in the pale hour before dawn when Jacques, the oldest of the church caretakers, went out to ring the bell. His lantern threw long, shaky shadows against the whitewashed wall, and his breath came out like steam in the chill. He had been at Bel Hombre for 20 years, sweeping the nave, trimming candles, keeping the leaded windows free of grime. He was the sort of man who did not startle easily. That morning, he did. A streak of dark had cleaved the stone of the steps, not a smear but a deliberate layout, each drop spaced like punctuation. Someone had arranged them in a line from the chapel door down to the yard, a path of blood that ended at the iron gate. At each interval, a small scrap of calico lay folded, neat squares of blue and white, like the remnants of a patchwork quilt. Jacques' lantern shook so hard that the flame guttered, his hand trembling as if with the chill of a fever. He knelt, touched one piece with a finger gloved in work-worn leather, and felt the tacky resistance of old blood. By the time Sheriff Lagrange arrived, half the town was crowded in the square. Men who had previously scoffed at rumors now stood with mouths thin as a surgeon's line. Delaroche's face was everywhere in painted parlor portraits, in a funeral wreath propped against the church porch, and now his memory was a thing the town could not ignore. Lagrange called a hurried meeting in the sheriff's office. The men who came wore coats heavy with cane dust and faces set to a look that merged anger with fear. Silas Mott arrived last, his jaw clenched, a new bruise about his temple that he explained as a fall from a horse. He refused to look at the blood on the steps when the sheriff described it aloud. "You tell me nobody saw anything?" Lagrange demanded. "Not a lantern, a boat, a collar. Someone had to pass through here," Mott said, and for once his voice had little of the overseer's bluster. "They wanted a message left at the foot of the house of God." He spat onto the floor as if to banish the smell. "We can't bury this and pretend it's a freak thing." The inquest heat rose like a fever. Men who had been cordial at harvest meetings now found themselves at odds. Two merchants who had once shared cigars left the courthouse in opposite directions, jaws set as if to prepare for war. The social glue of the parish marriages, favors, and a shared table had been splintered by an act that everyone had an opinion about, and no one wanted to endure the consequences of investigating fully. As the days passed, the sheriff's list grew long. He petitioned the governor for extra men, not for immediate arrests, but to steady the nerves of planters who feared uprising. The militia was not sent outright, but officers' names were penciled in the margins of his ledger as potential backup. The planters whispered about marsh fires and bands of runaways. They spoke of the Haitian insurrection like a ghost that had not remained an old story, but returned as a warning. But suspicion is a slow-acting poison. It infiltrates the bones of a parish and eats away at trust until neighbors see each other as potential enemies. What had been a scandal became, with the passage of only weeks, a war of insinuations. Men made lists of those who might benefit from the colonel's death. Family quarrels that had been hushed now bled into public spaces. A cousin cut from the will. A rival with debts to settle. A foreign merchant with a grudge about shipping rights. Each hypothesis was a spark. Even the Delaroche household began to fracture. Lucien's brother-in-law, Armand, came down from New Orleans and took up residence for a time, ostensibly to help settle affairs. He moved through the parlor with the air of someone who had never done hard labor but who felt entitled to decision. He argued with Silas about how to keep order among the workers and pressed the sheriff for results. Genevieve's funeral had repealed what little veneer of gentility had remained. In her absence, arguments over the estate's accounts started like wasps, vicious and quick. Mott, meanwhile, grew colder. Where once he had been a man who barked orders to keep the sugar line moving, now he spoke in short sentences, as if each word cost him money. He began to patrol the perimeter of Bel Ombre with a lantern and a pistol, though the value of those trinkets against whatever had happened was uncertain. One night, a hired hand told Lagrange that he had seen Mott standing at the edge of the cane with his back to the house, whispering into the dark as if beseeching some unseen force. "I saw him with his hands raised like a beggar," the man said. "He prayed, but not to God, to the wind." Rumors of a rebel cell, a small group of runaways hidden in the Atchafalaya swamps, were whispered into the ears of men sensitive to the tremors of control being lost. The planters feared not only the loss of wealth, but the collapse of the order that made genteel life possible. Runaways were more terrifying than murder because they represented refusal, an act of agency that refused to be contained. If Clara had run with a band of Maroons, then the notion that the powerless could act with precise, devastating intent became possible. And possibility is a dangerous thing to acknowledge when your wealth rests on denying another's freedom. Yet there were clues that did not fit the simple narrative of runaway bands. Dr. Moreau had discovered specialized cuts that implied a knowledge of anatomy. A few of the colonel's fingers had been severed at the joints in a manner that suggested the hand that did it knew precisely which tendons to cut to keep a victim from calling out. In the quarters, old women who tended the sick said that a skill like that could be learned by watching a surgeon in a sick room or by tending to bones in a place where medicine and folklore overlapped. The apothecary in Opelousas, a man who kept a ledger of medicines and surgical equipment, reported an uptick in purchases of linen and certain medicinal acids in the weeks before the murder, but his ledger did not name a buyer. Lagrange began to look inward. Perhaps a man within the house, a stock boy, the gardener, someone with access had learned from passing hands. Or maybe the colonel's enemies were closer than anyone would admit. If it was true that arithmetical precision and a steady hand had been used, where would someone have found such training? There was the local physician who made house calls to the plantations. There was a millwright who repaired equipment and knew the mechanics of the human body from accidents in the fields. There were also the enslaved healers, herbalists, who were respected and feared in equal measure for the power of their knowledge, a knowledge that, in that disordered world, blurred the line between medicine and ritual. An unsaid fear took hold. Perhaps the colonel's own actions had engineered a response. Men who are cruel to others often set in motion a chain reaction they cannot control, like a distillery overheated and set to boil dry. Delaroche's own entries in a private ledger unearthed later hinted at his experimenting with corrections, meant to stamp obedience onto the soul. He wrote of tests of endurance and of the need to break the spirit to preserve order. If he had been engaged in acts that pushed human beings to a point beyond bearing, who could say what form of return that cruelty might take? As suspicion deepened, so did the small acts of retaliation. Plowshares were blunted overnight. Horses were found with their harnesses chewed. The colonel's favorite hunting dog was found dead in the lane, its throat cut cleanly. At first, the planters dismissed these events as petty revenge. Then they noticed the pattern, the timing, the specificity, the way each act targeted something intimate rather than valuable. These were not thefts to feed hungry mouths. They were messages. We can reach you where you least expect it. When a second package arrived at Lucien Delaroche's study, this one wrapped in oilcloth and smelling faintly of camphor, the sheriff's patience found a new edge. Inside lay a small bone, polished smooth, tied with ribbon. A scrap of cloth accompanied it, and on the cloth, threaded in black, was the same phrase that had been found on the colonel's chest. I am no one's property. It was at this moment, standing in a room sunk in the shadow of curtains, that Lagrange realized the crime had become more than a killing. It was a conversation, and the remainder of a man's body was the alphabet. Whoever had done this was speaking in a language the parish had refused to hear for years. People began to talk differently. In parlors, the weekly chess games halted. Men who once shared political gossip now canceled their evenings. Some wives worried openly and demanded the militia for protection. Others held their heads high, pretending nothing had changed. But on the plantations where the fields were closest to the swamp, the workers whose hands had molded the land into profit moved with a new caution. They watched, not with the reckless hope of escape, but with an awareness that someone among them had acted, or that the world had shifted enough to allow for acts that the law was not ready to answer. Arguments about motive spun into the courthouse like moths around a lamp. Some declared the act sacrificial, a spiritual revenge enacted by those who had been wronged beyond words. Others declared it purely earthly revenge, cold, deliberate, and human in its cruelty. Still others insisted madness was at work, a broken mind that had figured out anatomical cruelty as artistry. The debate itself became fuel for the papers. New Orleans editors wrote columns about the peculiar Southern mind, while abolitionist pamphlets in the North used the story as evidence for the inherent violence of slavery. At a hotly attended town meeting, where men crowded the bench and the sheriff's office overflowed with press and parishioners, Lagrange stood and let the room roar itself out. He then spoke into the sudden hush like a man dropping a stone into a well. What do you think, guilty souls cursed by God, or victims of madness? Tell us below. Your theories matter here. The question landed not as an invitation but as a challenge. It forced people to choose how they would view what had happened, as a single monstrous act or as a mirror held up to a system. For some, the answer was simple. A woman had been pushed too far. For others, the thought of complicity was unbearable, and any explanation that involved systemic guilt was tossed aside like a refuse. The midsection of the parish's life was now a battleground. The sheriff's investigation had discovered a web of small truths and larger silences. It had unearthed purchase records, witness accounts, and rumors of maroons and healers. It had failed to produce a firm suspect, and most dangerous of all, it had shown how closely knit the planter class was with those sworn to uphold the law. As autumn pressed down into November, the cane harvest lagged. Hands moved slower, talking less. The Delaroche estate sank into a private war of measures. Locks were added, portraits were moved, and men paced at night keeping watch. Yet no watch could fully guard against an idea that had already taken root, that the people who were supposed to be property could, in certain circumstances, reclaim a terrifying agency. When the inquest finally adjourned with no definitive indictment, the parish felt a small seismic shift. Men returned to their daily tasks with shoulders tighter and voices lower. The sheriff carried the weight of the unanswered question like a book too heavy to hold at arm's length. And somewhere in the sludge and reeds beyond Bel Ombre, people who had always been unseen moved with a different cadence, quieter, surer, as if they knew that the world had shifted for them too. The stage was set for something that would compel the parish to confront not only a brutal act, but the architecture that made such brutality possible. The question of who would stand in the dock would not be solved by witness testimony alone. It would require an uncovering the likes of which the parish had not seen, a revelation that would drag truth into the glare and force even the most respectable to flinch.